Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to Addis Dialogue with the program. I'm Shifarao Lako, and I've got you special guest today is Jeffrey Sachs. He's a global renowned economics professor. He's the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's also president of UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He has served as advisor to 3 UN secretaries general. We're going to talk about a host of issues unfolding in Africa, in Ethiopia, and the entire globe. Do stay with us, Professor. Thank you so much for joining me and for making the time to talk to us.
What a great pleasure it is to be with you. Thank you for asking me.
Absolutely, thank you. So let me just jump right into the question. And in one of your recent articles headlined, "The West's False Narrative About Russia and China," you say, sir, the bipartisan US approach to foreign policy is unaccountably dangerous and wrong-headed. And you warn that the US is creating a recipe for yet another war, and this time around in East Asia. So I want to start our discussion with this. Could we, kind of end up in a third world war? Should we be concerned?
We have terrible tensions between the major powers. Obviously, an open and violent war in Ukraine, which, while it's partly a war within Ukraine and partly a war between Russia and Ukraine, it's also a proxy war between Russia and the United States in some ways, or the US, NATO alliance and Russia. So that's one seething war, very dangerous. Even a lot of talk about nuclear war and nuclear threats in the past couple of weeks because of the Ukraine war. And then in Asia, a lot of tensions between the United States and China. And these especially multiplied after the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, flew to Taiwan. And this, of course, made the government in Beijing very upset. And then the US doubled down, well, that's our right to do what we want and so forth. And the tensions between the US and China are extremely high. Not just over an event like this, but reflecting the worsening bilateral relationship over many years for a number of reasons. Well, when you have this kind of tension, you have a lot of risk. And so we are at risk, and we need the major powers, and since I'm an American, I call on my own government first, to calm down. Talk to the other side, stop the unilateralism, stop the threats, because the world is extremely destabilized right now after COVID and climate change and the war in Ukraine and the sanctions regime and all the other shocks that are hitting. Too much instability, and we need building, not destruction. And so we should be absolutely calming down, and especially talking with the other side, because if you don't talk to the other side, there's no chance of solutions to any of these problems.
As you know, the whole continent of Africa, and of course Ethiopia included, is also being bombarded by West patronizing, as some say, narratives that still want to, undermine the continent. The West is also being accused of being a supporter of some terrorist groups. So I'm kind of curious here, why are they doing this, and what benefit can possibly be gotten out of this?
Powerful countries meddle in other countries' issues. Yeah. And in the case of Africa, it was more than meddling. It was 100 or more years of direct imperial rule. And after the end of imperialism, the powerful Western countries continued to meddle, either because they were feeling that this was a proxy war for US-Soviet competition, or now US-China competition, or because they wanted minerals at low prices or some other resource. It's been a mix of motives, but basically because the power relations are so unequal and the arrogance is so high on the powerful side, the result is just chronically deficient. Rich country governments don't listen well. They don't respond well. They often behave badly. They think of themselves. They think that because they have the weapons, they have the right to do what they want. They make a mess so often. Look at what happened when NATO, especially the US, France, and UK, decided, well, it's time to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. Of course, they don't know anything really about Libyan politics and the like, but they decided they didn't like Gaddafi there anymore. And so NATO launched an attack in 2011. By the end of the year, Gaddafi was dead, and there has been chaos there since then. So this has been more than a decade of instability that was created by NATO intervening in this way. And they're not thoughtful because they just don't know. And they're not listening, and they're not discussing very often. And so we get these terrible outcomes. You know, I've looked at length, of course, as in the economic history and in the political history of these relations. One of the shocking examples to this day is Congo. Now the Democratic Republic of Congo, before that Zaire, before that the Belgian Congo. And when the Belgians, who ran the place like a prison camp, finally left at the end of the 1950s, a very popular, charismatic young politician, Patrice Lumumba, became prime minister. And you know what? The United States decided he's too popular. We have to throw him out. Not just throw him out, actually kill him. And of course, the CIA cooperated with the other security forces to assassinate Lumumba, and then put in place a dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko, who lasted for the next 30 years. And then that country has been plagued by turmoil, by corruption, by every kind of instability. But what did the West, so-called, do? It did little more than meddle, and destabilize. And, you know, in the end of the day, it's exhausting because it's just terrible. That's a country of 90 million people, almost all living in extreme poverty right now. After all this time, it's still an unstable country. And the so-called Western world did nothing to stabilize it, quite the contrary. And we see this kind of pattern in so many places, not just in Africa, all over the world. I'm 67 years old. I've lived through so many American misadventures. When I was a kid, Vietnam War, the Cambodian War, the war in Laos, completely destructive by the US side. Yeah, we had the bombs, but we had no solutions to anything. And then we had wars in Central America, and those countries are still in disarray and poverty and violence until now, even 30 to 40 years after the US intervened militarily. And then the wars in the Middle East, in Iraq, Afghanistan, the secret operation of the CIA to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the NATO operation in Libya. So it's a lot of destabilization. And if we had taken the chance instead to really strategize on how to achieve development, how to build infrastructure, how to enable poor regions to create electrification, water systems, irrigation, digital connectivity. Oh, how much better the world would be. So great power politics often leads just to destruction, and it traps a lot of countries in the middle when great powers are fighting over their heads. And this is really what we need to stop.
Yeah. So I think, sir, in this connection, the recent report of the International Commission of Human Rights experts on Ethiopia can be, I personally believe, a case in point. The report tries to come up with a host of accusations and allegations against Ethiopia. And many are playing it down as incomplete, incoherent, and politically motivated, as it is carried out by a small number of experts or so-called experts. So can you talk me through some of your scholarly views, of course, if you've seen the report or if you've heard about it?
Well, I've looked at it, of course. I think the basic point for Ethiopia is the following. Ethiopia needs peace and development, and especially it needs investment. It needs investment in schooling, it needs investment in health systems, it needs investment in electrification, it needs investment in agricultural upgrading, it needs urban infrastructure, it needs digital connectivity. Ethiopia is filled with very clever people, so if there were peace and financial means, these investments could scale up quite quickly. There are many examples in modern Ethiopia's history of quite rapid scaling up of worthwhile investments when the finance has been there and when the opportunity has been there. So the agenda for Ethiopia is very clear. Ethiopia is also very troubled because of deep historical animosities, the political history of instability, the interethnic conflicts, the distrust, and so on. And now quite a violent war. And I really would hope that Ethiopia's leaders would say, we need a trusted set of outside mediators, friends of Ethiopia, who can help us find a way out of this to make the transition from violence to investment. And it's very hard to do from the inside alone. From the inside alone, it looks like a terrible, inevitable struggle between military forces, between militias, between ethnic groups, and so on. And vengeance and further vengeance and so forth is the logic. But in such a situation, my own recommendation would be that the Ethiopian government say, look, this doesn't work for us, even if we're winning or not winning, whatever. We need to find a way out, and we need mediation. Mediation doesn't mean that outsiders dictate. Mediation means that outsiders listen, make recommendations, make win-win suggestions. Good mediators would say, look, if there's a path to peace, we should also really go get help for Ethiopia's economic development. Let's get a lot more financing for electrification, for agriculture, for other things, so that you bring as part of the package the not just sweeteners, but actually the real story of improving people's lives in Ethiopia. So that's what I would recommend, because there's so much hatred, distrust, bitterness, and violence inside. It's very hard to stop. I've had the chance to visit a lot of Ethiopia over the past 25 years. I've seen a lot of the country. I've seen places in Tigray that are now under terrible crisis, but I saw them in peacetime, and it breaks my heart, the violence. But it breaks my heart, the violence all over the country and all of the challenges. So I think Ethiopia should really try to find some outside friends, not to impose, but to help mediate the conflict.
Yeah, Professor, I think in this regard, I think the Ethiopian government is ready to come to the negotiation table under the auspices of the African Union. You know, as you said, without other nations dictating, but helping. So my question would be, is this a pattern repeated or done over and over again by the West, not only in Ethiopia, but in some parts of the globe or Africa? What is your observation?
Well, my basic observation would be that the African Union would be absolutely the right place to provide services of mediation. And I would say that beyond the African Union, there are friends of Ethiopia that would love to help. I'm raising my own hand in the sense that Ethiopia is a country I know well, care about, and see from the economic development perspective as a country that really needs a lot of investment to improve people's lives. Yeah. So I think the right way to do this is the African Union. I have, by the way, a special kind of assignment in the UN system right now, which is to try to help countries in financial distress find ways to mobilize more resources for sustainable development. And by that, I mean for clean electrification, for digital connectivity, for schooling, for healthcare, for things that really matter. And I'm on a campaign to raise more money for low income and lower middle income countries so that we don't just talk about development, but we actually see it happen, and not in tiny little parcels, but on a large scale. Ethiopia needs this kind of support as well. It needs a big inflow of finance in order to be able to make some breakthroughs in infrastructure across the country. Now, this, I think, is part of helping to make peace as well. So I think the African Union is the right place. Of course, that's solution should begin at home. And I think the African Union could find friends that would help to amplify win-win solutions. And the sooner the better. Not only is there a lot of suffering, but there's a lot of need right now for breakthroughs. Yeah,
beautifully put, sir. You know what? The other issue that this East African nation is facing is threats of sanctions. As you know, Ethiopia has been suspended from AGOA. And it has also been threatened with sanctions of the new bill, such as HR 6600 S3199. So why are the US doing this, at the expense of Ethiopia or at the expense of this age-long bilateral ties between the two countries?
Well, I have not followed in detail the specifics, so I have to say that at the beginning. But in general, the US uses sanctions because they're cheap, because they don't cost money, they don't involve troops, and they think that these sanctions give leverage to US foreign policy. I'm not a fan of sanctions because I don't think they work, but they do punish the population. So while I can't speak to the specifics of the Ethiopian case, I have been very outspoken against US sanctions with regard to Venezuela, with regard to Iran, with regard to other countries. The US uses them because it's easy. You don't require a vote of Congress, even in general. Presidents can make executive orders. The public isn't aware of them. They don't have a direct budget outlay. but they hurt, and they can hurt badly. And for a country like Ethiopia, which is, needs development, it doesn't need sanctions. This is just the wrong approach. But I've often pointed out that the US sanctions regimes just don't solve political problems. It's not the right way. So in Venezuela, the US wanted to overthrow the government, actually, and it decided that it would impose crushing economic sanctions against the Maduro government. But you know what? Trump put those on in 2017. It's 5 years later. President Maduro is still very much in power. They didn't have the political effect, but they sure did crush the Venezuelan economy for no reason, because it didn't follow through politically. Now the US has put on these sanctions against Russia. This is also, I predicted immediately, well, that's not going to stop the war. That's not going to defeat Russia. That's not going to make Putin change his mind about what the Russian leaders regard as fundamental security interests for Russia. So I said the US is once again exaggerating the power of these sanctions. But the interesting thing about the sanctions on Russia is that they're probably doing huge damage in Europe, maybe even more than Russia. Russia's changed the direction for its oil exports, but Europe is now in an energy crisis because basically the sanctions and the harsh conflict between Europe and Russia over the Ukraine wars led Russia to turn off the pipeline, basically, of gas. All of this is to say, I'm a development economist. My perspective and my job is to help build economies. That's very hard work. It takes 20 years, 30 years. You have to be steadfast. And then most of the time, or not most of the time, but much of the time, I'm confronting policies designed to crush economies, or even worse, war, which just destroys the infrastructure that it took years and years and years to build. And I can't explain to you how frustrating this is. If your job is to build, to watch how easy it is to have the destruction. It's just terrible. I look at Ukraine right now, which of course is incurring unbelievable costs, in my view, because of the failure of the US to negotiate properly with Russia as a major reason for this war. But Ukraine is seeing its cities destroyed, and then it turns around and says, well, we expect $750 billion of help to rebuild what we just knocked, what was just knocked down. Well, first of all, it's not going to happen. But how mind-boggling is it when the world needs to make new investments to be spending huge amounts to rebuild what our bombs have just destroyed? This is no way to operate.
One of the most impressive ideas, of course, your ideas are all impressive. I'm a big fan, by the way. One of the most impressive ideas you brought up was the idea of G21 and not G20. You argue for a G21 with the great continent of Africa added to G20. This is obviously, I think, long overdue. And as such, it is deliberately being oblivious, so to speak, to the billions of people on the continent of Africa. So how should they the West revise their policy toward Africa?
So let me say the G20 is a really interesting institution. I played a tiny role also in helping it to get started in the following way. We used to have the G7, which is, and we still have the G7. The G7 are the rich Western countries, the United States, Canada, UK, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan. And the G7 met for a long time. At the end of the 1990s, I recommended, and then Russia was added, actually, in the days when there was still cooperation with Russia after the end of the Cold War. There was therefore the G8. I recommended at the end of the 1990s, let's have the G16. I said, bring in 8 developing countries alongside the 8 advanced countries so that we have a true worldwide dialogue. Well, I think this may have played some role, I'm not sure, but soon after the G20 was announced in its first incarnation, which was that developing countries and developed countries would meet across the table. What we have today is a quite useful grouping. It's the 20 large economies of the world. It includes China, India, Russia. Indonesia is the host this year. Brazil will be a host in 2024. India actually next year. So instead of just the rich countries dominating, it now is 20 economies. But it's interesting. First of all, among the 20 economies, there's only one from Africa, and that is South Africa, which really can't represent all 1.4 billion people in 54 countries of the African Union, after all. So that's one problem. And in general, the voice of Africa is, of course, not heard properly. But I noticed in thinking about it that not only are there 19 individual countries in the G20, there's actually the European Union as a union as the 20th member. So all 27 European countries are represented by the European Union as the 20th member. Mm-hmm. So I said, why not have the 21st now the African Union? Because that would bring in immediately 1.4 billion people into the conversation, into representation at the G20, and about $3 trillion of economy. So you'd get a large part of the world represented that isn't represented in a quite convenient way. At the General Assembly last week, President Macky Sall of Senegal, who is the chairperson of the African Union, spoke very clearly and vividly calling for Africa's membership as the G20 first country. I think that there's a good chance that this will happen, probably not in Bali when the G20 meets this year, but probably yes, when the G20 meets in India in 2023. And I would like African leaders all across Africa to say, come on, we need to be at the table. Stop talking about us, start talking with us. Mm-hmm. And I think that this could make a huge difference because the G20 actually works on some very pertinent, real things, especially international financial flows that are of core interest for Africa's development.
Wow, what a brilliant idea, Professor. Let's hope so. Let's hope that Africans' voice will be heard. Thank you so much for your time, for your brilliant ideas, brother.
Great to be with you, and let's hope for Ethiopia's peaceful and rapid development. That's what we need.
Yeah, let's hope so. Thank you again. Well, dear viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program. Thank you as well for having been with us.